Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to get started. So happy to see all of you. So thanks for joining us and welcome to this afternoon's program. I'm Jamie Seward, Associate Director of Affinity Engagement Programs with the Office of Alumni Relations. Before we proceed, I'd like to acknowledge our co-sponsors, the Department of Neurology and Brain Sciences and the Healthcare Affinity. Now, before I turn the program over to our moderator, I encourage you to ask questions by typing them in the Zoom Q&A, and that's located at the bottom of your screen. Now, I have the pleasure of turning the program over to our moderator, Gina Scalise, Senior Associate Director of Development for the Department of Neurology and Brain Sciences. Gina?
Great. Thank you, Jamie. It's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Mackenzie C. Cervenka, Associate Professor of Neurology and Director of the Johns Hopkins Epilepsy Monitoring Unit in the Johns Hopkins Adult Epilepsy Diet Center. Dr. Cervenka focuses on the diagnosis and treatment of adults with seizures and epilepsy, with a clinical and research interest in ketogenic diet therapies for adults with epilepsy and other neurologic disorders. Dr. Cervenka, you can take it from here.
Thank you so much, Gina, for that really nice introduction, and welcome everyone. Today, I'm going to be talking about neurological wellness, how dietary habits can improve your brain. I first want to talk about the history of dietary changes associated with the treatment of a condition called epilepsy. I am in fact a neurologist who specializes in the area of epilepsy. And what epilepsy is, for those in the audience that may not be familiar with it, it is a condition in which patients can have seizures or a seizure disorder with uncontrolled seizures that can happen unpredictably. If we look back at changes in dietary habits that can help treat epilepsy, we can look back as far as Hippocrates, who spoke about body purification as part of the management of seizure disorders. If we fast forward to the 1800s, Charles Radcliffe wrote about high-fat oil diets that were helpful in the management of seizures. In 1911, the concept of fasting was brought to the United States as a potential treatment for epilepsy. And actually, exactly 100 years ago, the term ketogenic diet came into the medical literature as a possible mode for treating epilepsy. Now, you maybe have heard about the ketogenic diet in the past few years as a fad diet for weight loss, but actually, if we look back, this diet has been around for 100 years now, primarily as a medical therapy. More on the history of these ketogenic diet therapies. As with other types of treatment, after diet was proposed as a management strategy for epilepsy, medications became available, anti-seizure drugs that patients would take, and the diet sort of fell out of favor around that time because patients would be able to take a medication and not have to alter their lifestyle in order to treat their seizures. However, it readily became apparent that for some patients, those medications don't necessarily work, unfortunately, or they can have specific side effects. And then the diet reemerged just in the past several decades as a potential management for epilepsy, either in combination with these medications or in very rare circumstances as an alternate method of treatment. There was a medium chain triglyceride oil diet proposed, and then the diet became very popular again, specifically in children in around the 1990s, in part because of strong support from a foundation called the Charlie Foundation and Jim Abrams, who started the Charlie Foundation, along with a team from Hopkins as well. In 2003, Dr. Eric Kossoff at Johns Hopkins proposed a modified Atkins diet, which was a modified version of the ketogenic diet. And then in 2005, another team at Mass General also proposed a low glycemic index treatment, yet another modification. Why do we call these diets ketogenic? A ketogenic diet is any kind of a diet in which the body preferentially uses fat as a fuel source. What that means is that you consume fatty acids, which enter the liver. Those fatty acids are broken down into beta hydroxybutyrate, acetoacetate, and acetone, which are ketone bodies, and those can enter the circulation and enter the brain as a fuel source. The classic American diet is consistent of over 50% carbohydrate, and the classic ketogenic diet is consisting of over 90% fat. Neither of these are, quote, healthy diets that the human body was designed to utilize. In fact, the high carbohydrate diet that the standard American might consume, unfortunately, is also responsible for the epidemic of obesity and diabetes because of the high carbohydrate intake and the inability to process the fat that's eaten. Whereas a ketogenic diet is extraordinarily high fat, and therefore we now refer to these ketogenic diets as ketogenic diet therapies because they do need to be monitored by a physician and by a dedicated specialized team. Here is part of my specialized team. I'm showing you here myself and the dietitian I work with, dietitian Bobby Henry Barron, and we both work in the Adult Epilepsy Diet Center at Johns Hopkins, where we teach adults to use a specialized diet called the Modified Atkins diet. And in fact, we have been able to do this virtually and from this exact office using technology. And we have been able to do that during the COVID pandemic as well. You'll be hearing some more from Dr. Marilyn Albert about different types of wellness changes that can be made to address dementia and Alzheimer's disease. So I won't go into much detail about that, but just to say that these ketogenic diets are being explored for this purpose as well, because what we know is that Alzheimer's is like type 3 diabetes as what we consider it, because the brain does not utilize glucose as well. And these ketone bodies could be used as an alternate fuel source. Another very exciting avenue that's being explored at Johns Hopkins is the use of these types of ketogenic diet therapies in the management of very aggressive types of brain tumors. And so you'll hopefully hear more about that in the future. We have a lot of fun with our ketogenic diet therapies. So we have parties sometimes, and we really enjoy our ketogenic sweets. And now I just want to thank you all for hearing about an introduction on ketogenic diet therapies. And I want to introduce you to a special guest. He is Mr. Chris Garrett, and he's a patient of mine. And he's going to talk to you a little bit about his ketogenic diet therapy, the Modified Atkins diet.
Okay, hi everyone. Let me stop my video, one sec. Hope this works. Yep. Hi guys. Hi everyone. Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Cervenka, and also everyone to Johns Hopkins team for letting me discuss my experience. Yep. I'm actually an attorney here in Bermuda, so unfortunately I can't show you outside, but it's a little bit windy, but it's quite nice. I've been on the ketogenic diet for the last 7 years now. Whether you want to call it ketogenic diet or modified Atkins diet, I'll use the word keto just to make it easier. It's been an adjustment, but I have to say I actually quite enjoy it now. So much so to the extent that, you know, when I'm in a restaurant and I look across and I see someone eating a plate of French fries doused in ketchup, I actually think, oh, goodness me, how can they do that to their body and their brain or whatever? It's a learning curve for sure. But right now, if you drop me into a grocery store, it's so easy for me just to walk around and pick out exactly what I want. I've become a total expert when it comes to nutritional labels and looking at the fat contents and whether it's net fiber and proteins and so on, the easy stuff to avoid. I mean, the easy stuff to avoid being things like sugars and cakes. And so you say goodbye to M&Ms, you never see those again. But, starches, I have a 12-year-old and a 10-year-old. And so sitting at a table with them, they're ordering pizza and pasta. You get used to that. That's not actually such a big deal. You know, fruits you tend to have to avoid. Things like berries are okay, for sure. And obviously things like which are low fat, there's no point being on a high fat diet and buying low fat stuff. But then there's the stuff you can enjoy. So, you know, if you continue to like meats, then, you know, I still eat loads of meat. Fish, fatty fish is great. You know, eggs become one of your best friends along with avocado. Eggs are great because they also keep you really full. Avocado is great because it's full of fat and basically absolutely zero in protein as well as zero in carbs. Nuts are great depending on the types of nuts. I can give you a whole list of what nuts are better than other nuts, but cheese, olive oil, you know, if you get fish and some fish is not as oily as other fish, then you can just douse olive oil over everything. So olive oil, whatever, coconut oil is also great. And dark chocolate. So don't think you're going to give up chocolate per se, but it may just have to be 95% chocolate, or if you're like me, baker's chocolate, which some people find kind of strange, but I actually don't mind baker's chocolate as a snack. You have to be a little careful. You have to avoid salt. Some things can be a bit salty, so you have to be very careful about that. You also have to be a bit careful about moderating your protein and avoiding buying stuff which is too high in protein as well. That can be an easy trap. I actually don't really keep track too much of what I'm basically buying now because I'm so used to it. You know, I think as you know, Dr. McKenzie said, this is something which you don't do as a fad. You know, people do it for weight loss, and you know, that's not the reason why you would want to do it. You know, the only thing I'd say is that the benefit in terms of the fact that it's become so popular is that there's so much now more to actually get when you go into a grocery store. You know, this has become a popular diet. So there's just a lot more to get, like whether it's like cauliflower rice or risotto or things that are, you know, sort of that kind of stuff. You can just kind of keep that and put it in your freezer and bring it out whenever you want. So there's a lot more stuff out there. But I know people who have tried to do this to try to lose weight, and it's just, they just can't do it. It's a long-term commitment. And there's no point doing this. I do this purely for my brain health. And that's what's really become important for me. It's not something I'm going to come off at all. You know, I think it's very important. You know, it's been important for me from a seizure reduction standpoint. You know, it's not something for everyone, for sure. But, you know, I think, yeah, the sooner you try to do it, the better you do it. And, you know, I think it's just once you get used to it, it's actually really, 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 it's really, really, really good. And I just actually like it. So I don't know. I just think it's really, 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 you know, it's just, you know, I won't, you know, I just don't think it's not going to, you know, going to. So anyway, I, you know, so I think you know, I think, you know, yeah. So anyway. So.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Yeah. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Dr. Cervenka. We have a couple minutes for some Q&As. So if anybody does have questions, I encourage you to type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your bar here. But we do have a few, so I will go ahead and read those. Our first question is, can this be used by people with epilepsy and coronary artery disease?
That is an outstanding question, and one that we are actively trying to figure out a good answer to. A colleague of mine, Dr. Tanya McDonald, this is the focus of her area of research. We have a number of patients now who have been on these diets for many years because, as I mentioned, the diet became popular for children again back in the 1990s, or in fact, some patients have now been on it since the 1970s. And so we are looking at those individuals and seeing if they're at any higher risk for coronary artery disease. We are not finding that to be the case so far, but we're trying to do really sophisticated tests to try and have a better understanding, making sure that there are not long-term consequences of these diets. So stay tuned. That is something we are very interested in, and we want to make sure that the diet is safe. And Gina, I believe you are muted.
Yeah, it always happens at least once during one of these. So our next question is, it says that you've mentioned the diet needs to be monitored by a doctor. What are the key aspects that have to be monitored and controlled?
Well, just as the first question kind of alluded to, we do want to monitor lipid profiles. Most patients on the diet will see that they might have an increase in their cholesterol levels when they first start the diet, but that tends to improve over time. And so what we want to make sure is that is indeed the case. Now, in rare instances, patients may also have things like kidney stones if they're not making sure to be hydrated very well. And so we always want to make sure that we're avoiding any of these potential side effects and that patients are being treated appropriately and are cared for appropriately. So that's why we really stress that patients stay on, that follow up with a physician and also a dietitian as well. So it is a multidisciplinary team approach.
Great, thank you. And so we have a few questions around specific foods, including fruits. So questions around if fruits are allowed on the diet, and then should fruit sugars be prioritized over the complex carbohydrates?
So there are fruit, as Chris alluded to, there are fruits that are allowed with the diet. Typically, berries are lower in carbohydrate than fruits that we think of like apples and bananas. And so, and you always have to moderate the amount that you're eating. And so really, there aren't foods that are absolutely not allowed with the diet. It just has to do with the portion size and looking at the total carbohydrate content. One other thing that Chris alluded to was that in certain types of these ketogenic diet therapies, that fiber doesn't necessarily count in the carbohydrate count, and that's just with some of these therapies, in which case fruits that are higher in fiber can still be permitted. Again, that's always with portion control.
Thank you. And I think we have a few more minutes for a couple more questions. How do your recommendations change during the time of COVID-19?
So the recommendations actually have not changed with regards to starting the diet, maintaining the diet. And fortunately, we've had a number of patients who we've been able to meet with virtually through a Zoom meeting and actually have our own teaching session that we provide to them. We have separate Q&A sessions so they can meet with us as a group and talk about their diet. And that has actually been very successful during the pandemic. We have received some feedback. There might be certain food items or brands of things that have been in shortage as the pandemic has happened, but patients have really been able to, we help them find other alternatives to those and still be able to maintain their diet during the pandemic.
Thank you. And then we have a question here about, are there inflammatory effects from high fat dairy?
That is also, these are terrific questions. My goodness. All of these questions are wonderful. So that is a possibility. That is yet another area that we are exploring, and so are and other researchers both in basic science field looking at animal models of epilepsy and diet therapies and other neurologic conditions, and also in humans, because there are likely, and we know that different types of fat can be more pro-inflammatory rather than anti-inflammatory. We also know that for carbohydrates as well. And so we are very interested in whether there are certain types of fats when we're introducing a 90% fat diet or a 70% diet, should we be focusing on certain types of fats? When we first introduce the diet, we typically allow patients to use every type of fat because we want them to just get accustomed to the concept of the diet, get used to it. And then if we have to fine tune or we see problems with cholesterol that we're concerned about, we might adjust it towards some of these fats that are less inflammatory, but that's an excellent question.
Great, thank you. And I know we have a handful of other questions that we haven't yet gotten to. So hopefully we'll be able, Dr. Cervenka will be able to maybe address some of those via the chat functionality here. But what final one, where can people find out more information about the ketogenic diet or the modified Atkins diet?
Through their physician. So if you're a patient with epilepsy, we're happy to see you in one of our epilepsy diet centers. If you're, a patient with one of these other conditions that I spoke about, we do recommend doing it, as I mentioned earlier, with medical supervision. Your doctor could also be considering it depending on what your conditions are, and could reach out to an expert to help with that process. But certainly we do want you to do it under medical supervision if you're considering it.
Great, thank you so much. And to everybody who sent in a question, we will try and get those all answered as well. So, and now at this point, we are going to switch to Dr. Ellen Mowry. Dr. Mowry is a professor of neurology and epidemiology at Johns Hopkins University and co-director of the Johns Hopkins MS Precision Medicine Center of Excellence. Her research focuses on environmental factors that influence the risk and prognosis of multiple sclerosis, as well as on improving outcome measures for those with MS. So Dr. Mowry, feel free to take it over.
Thank you so much, Gina. I'm really happy to be here. So continuing on the theme of diet and how it relates to neurologic illness, I had a few objectives for my portion of today's session. First, I thought we could talk very briefly, as most people often want to know updates about the role of vitamin D in treating multiple sclerosis. Second, to describe why we might consider dietary interventions as potentially important for people with MS. And third, to describe the results of some of the dietary intervention studies that have been presented to date. So the brief story about vitamin D: low vitamin D levels have been associated with increased risk of developing multiple sclerosis in some studies. And we had shown in large groups of people who already had developed MS that in children in particular, higher levels of vitamin D were associated with a lower chance of having a relapse, which is an episode of neurologic symptoms such as a loss of vision, weakness, or numbness that often occur over and over again in people, particularly in the earlier phases of MS. Similarly, people with MS sometimes develop inflammatory induced changes in the brain called lesions or white spots that we can measure on the MRI scan, and higher levels of vitamin D in adults with MS were associated with much lower risk of developing new spots like that on the MRI scan. However, to date, there have been 2 randomized trials published using vitamin D therapy as an add-on to a baseline MS therapeutic intervention. And those studies have not actually demonstrated any benefit of vitamin D supplementation. I'm running a study called VIDAMS that has just finished, and we are currently analyzing the data. So we'll see if that's true in our study as well, which had a slightly different dosing and a different platform therapy. But stay tuned. The story of vitamin D supplementation and how effective it is still quite uncertain, despite the fact that these group studies showed an association of blood levels with both risk and outcomes for people with MS. Turning now to diet and how it might relate to MS, we think that diet itself might have important implications on the risk or the course of MS, and it may be a direct effect. It possibly could be modified through the bacteria in the gut. You've probably heard about the gut microbiome. And then another option or opportunity is that it might influence risk of obesity and related conditions. And that has a known implication for MS risk or course. So we'll go through some of these data now. Thinking about just broad patterns of dietary consumption and what kinds of things people eat, and then looking at whether those dietary patterns influence MS risk. There have been some studies out of Australia to suggest that eating a generally healthy diet, which is sort of like a Mediterranean style diet, which includes eating plenty of vegetables and fruits, not too many sort of sugary foods or unprocessed or more processed carbohydrates, rather eating more whole grains, if at all, eating more fish than red meat, etc. Eating a healthy diet generally was associated with lower risk of developing MS overall in the Australian population. Even more so when they added back red meat. So in some senses, red meat in at least one study didn't really increase the risk of MS. On the other hand, in a study of women that has been going on for a long time in the United States, there actually was no association of healthy diet intake and MS risk. So I think the jury is still out about whether there are specific dietary patterns that influence the risk of MS. When we look at specific components of the diet, the literature has been kind of all over the place, including for things like dairy and other things like that. Some recent studies that have come out have suggested, however, that eating fatty fish might be associated with a reduced risk of MS. Again, in this MS Sunshine study occurred in Southern California, and individuals who reported eating at least one serving of fatty fish a week had a much lower risk of later developing multiple sclerosis. And even genetically, there were genes that are associated with how fats are metabolized, and even those were associated with a lower risk of multiple sclerosis. Similarly, a study in Australia showed that eating fish, and in here they found the difference if you ate 2 servings of fish a week or more, particularly fatty fish, had a lower risk of developing multiple sclerosis. One thing to keep in mind is that most of these studies, however, ask people about their diets around the time that they're being diagnosed with MS. And we know that people with MS often for the several years leading up to a diagnosis may start to feel unwell. They just don't have specific neurological symptoms. And so it's possible that in response to not feeling super great, or in response to having received a new diagnosis of MS, people had already changed their dietary habits in favor of healthier diets. So I think that ideally we would want to measure people who are, starting in childhood and, early adulthood, who really hadn't developed any symptoms, even prodromal symptoms of MS, to understand how long-term diet impacts risk. Now, turning to thinking about the MS course. So once a person has been diagnosed with MS, there are many things that we can study to evaluate whether a particular intervention has an impact on the course. So early in MS, the disease is characterized, as I mentioned before, by relapses or exacerbations or flare-ups of neurological symptoms, such as weakness or numbness, trouble walking or trouble seeing. And we also see, sometimes associated with the relapse and sometimes independent of the relapse, white spots that show up on the MRI scans of the brain and even the spinal cord. And while that's going on, sometimes there is damage that occurs to the underlying nerve wires as well as a result of that inflammation, which can cause the nerve wires to slowly die off and the brain to shrink, so a reduced brain volume. And if there's enough loss of nerve wires, then at a certain point, it's very hard for the person's brain to continue to compensate for the loss of those nerve wires. And they might, instead of having intermittent symptoms, have a slowly worsening neurologic disability. And we call that progressive MS. If it had been preceded by prior inflammation and attacks, we call it secondary progressive. If a person had never really noticed those types of attacks, we call it primary progressive MS. And so we can follow relapses and new white spots on the MRI scan early in the disease. And as well, we can follow slow worsening of disability, as well as brain volumes on MRI scan later on in the disease. And interestingly, brain MRI scans and shrinkage of the brain early on is a risk factor for later developing this more progressive clinical set of symptoms. So at the Hopkins MS Precision Medicine Center of Excellence, we do this by studying people, all the people as they come through the clinic, using iPads to track neurologic function. We do blood studies. We track degeneration of the brain tissue through eye imaging, as well as standardized brain imaging. We ask people about their diets and other healthy lifestyle factors through studies, questionnaire-based studies. And we're trying to stand up tracking progression of disability through also a very fancy Fitbit. Stay tuned on that. So leveraging these data and some of the data we pushed together with MS centers through a sponsored program called MS Paths, we were able to study whether aspects related to diet, specifically illnesses that we consider related to obesity, such as diabetes, high blood pressure, and high cholesterol, were associated with worse performance on the iPad-based neurologic tasks. And people who had more of these obesity-related complications walked slower and had worse performance on hand dexterities tests, which means moving pegs from one side to the other of a board, and also had worse cognition. We had also shown that people with MS who were more obese had faster shrinkage of the gray matter compartments of the brain, the brain tissue that is most strongly associated with increased risk of disability long-term in people with MS. And through the OCT eye measures that people get at the Johns Hopkins MS Center, we also saw that obesity was associated with greater shrinkage or atrophy of the nerve cells in the eyes. Again, back to the large cohort, and this time including more than 6,000 people with MS, again, confirming that the conditions related to obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure, and high cholesterol, all associated with overall faster shrinkage of the brain, but in particular, higher shrinkage of the gray matter, which is one of the strongest predictors of long-term disability risk for people with MS. In general, and through our CHARM study, in which we assess through questionnaires how people are eating, exercise, and sleeping, we did see that those who had better quality diet, and we measured the quality of the diet through two indices. One is called the Healthy Eating Index, and the other is called a Mediterranean Diet Score. And we saw that those who had the highest quality diet, here on the graph demonstrated by quartile 4, were faster in walking. And the results were quite similar, trending in the right direction for improvements or better thinking and memory, as well as dexterity of hand movements. In a larger registry study where patients indicated information about their dietary intake, as well as how disabled they reported themselves to be, a similar trend was found in the nearly 7,000 people who were included. So those who had healthier diets in general were less likely to report being disabled. They also reported less depression. So why would diet and specifically some of these obesity-related complications be important for MS and neurologic function in general? We know that obesity might trigger autoimmune disease activity by changing many of the organs that are associated with immune system functioning and cause the immune system to do a worse job at what it's supposed to do, which is to leave out the bad guys and let our normal body cells work. Also, the tissue that takes up the fat, which is called adipose tissue, leads to overall a chronic inflammatory state. So it can sort of predispose to heart disease and diabetes, but also then to neurodegeneration. And as we know that we have a problem where there's increased obesity really throughout the world. And so, people have speculated that that increase might be why more autoimmune diseases are occurring, including MS. We got interested in intervening on this because in a fasting style diet. And the reason is that there are mouse models of MS where the mice are given a variant of MS essentially. And there were scientists who did studies showing that the mouse that were deprived of food, mice who were deprived of food prior to inducing the MS-like disease actually were less likely to have the disease or had a less severe course of the disease through many different effects on the immune system. It also led to better healing from the disease and also was associated with less injury to the underlying nerve wires. We did a study in 36 people and did various forms of fasting. One group had a control diet, so they ate all the calories they typically would. One group had a mild reduction in calories every day, and one group had a more dramatic reduction in calories 2 days a week and ate their other calories otherwise, 100% of their calories 5 days a week. And we looked at whether there were any outcome differences in these individuals. Perhaps not surprisingly, those who were restricted to very low calorie intake had a little bit of a hard time following the diet, but they did a relatively good job. And the people who did a daily little bit of calorie reduction did a great job. And even the controls ate a little bit less than they were provided. And everyone actually lost weight. It sort of highlights the importance of having a control group. What we saw is that those who actually reduced their calorie intake had a clinically meaningful improvement over the course of 8 weeks in their depression, which is quite common in people with MS. We also noticed that the people who underwent calorie restriction had greater diversity change in their gut microbiota. So the bacterial populations became more diverse, which is typically associated with better health. We also did some very sophisticated studies of the underlying metabolism in the cells, and which had previously been shown to distinguish people with MS from healthy controls, and demonstrated that fasting or calorie reduction actually had a meaningful impact on several biologically relevant chemicals in the body. And so we'll stay tuned. People had a hard time, as I said, following this study for long, but we're very interested in how fasting and calorie reduction may influence MS. 2 other quick slides. Modified Atkins diet, like Dr. Cervenka was saying, has also been tested recently in 20 individuals with MS, so pretty small study without a control group, but the adherence was actually quite good. People were able to follow it pretty nicely, about 75% at 6 months. Overall, biologically, people did better where they lost weight and fat mass, and they actually had meaningful improvements in fatigue and depression scores. In the interim, what I currently recommend to my patients, although there have been no clinical trials other than this one to support it, is a Mediterranean style diet. In this particular study, again, a small study with 36 people. They also had quite high adherence after 6 months. And also reported improved fatigue scores. But more importantly, for people with MS, this is a diet I can tend to stand behind because although it hasn't been studied at length for the MS population, we do know that Mediterranean style diet can reduce the risk of diabetes and high blood pressure, which I had mentioned previously are associated with increased damage to the brain among people with MS. So I think diet is probably likely important for MS along with many other neurological conditions. We also talk a lot and have not had a chance to discuss here exercise and sleep as sort of a trifecta of healthy living. And we think that studying these biological impacts of changing the diet could help identify new treatment targets that could be targeted through new medications as well as through lifestyle. And you'll see Dr. Cervenka and a number of other folks in the neurology department here who are interested in studying diet, and we actually get together regularly to discuss and try to improve on our research. So with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Mowry. We have a handful of questions in our Q&A, so I will just start from the top here. And we have a question around the benefits for connective tissue and any concerns around that.
I'm not a connective tissue doctor, so I don't really know. I mean, people are studying, diets and in other health conditions as well. But I don't know if there's a specific role in connective tissue disorders.
Great. And then we have one around the optimal time period for intermittent fasting. 12 to 14 hours, is that sufficient, or 16 hours?
That's a great question too. Studies have shown that perhaps even, consuming all your meals in an 8-hour window, has reasonably similar benefits biologically compared to longer fasts. And we also did a pilot study, which I have not had the time to present today, demonstrating that that was also a lot easier for people to follow than even the small amount of calorie reduction that we did in the more rigorous study. And so, we don't recommend it yet to our patients because there aren't a lot of data to support it as for MS as a specific treatment. But for people who are going to fast, I typically recommend the 16-8 model, which is eating most of your foods within an 8-hour window, and giving your body a chance to sort of process, digest, and have a little bit of a fasting period before the next day.
Great, thank you. And then we have another question around what are some of the best superfoods to maintain brain health? This questionnaire references berries. So are there other foods that would help maintain that?
Thank you for that question. It's actually really hard to study foods themselves in isolation from overall dietary patterns. And I think that's why you see such conflicting results when you look from one study to the other. In folks with MS, as I mentioned, the most compelling evidence in my mind comes from studies with the healthy fishes and fatty fishes potentially being protective for MS. There's been a lot of interest in the kinds of fats that are included in fish and whether they may have a benefit in protecting the brain. But I know there are a lot of things out if you look on Google about superfoods and anti-inflammatory foods, but I think tends to be hard to study them in isolation because most people who are pretty good about eating lots of fruits, for example, and vegetables, are eating lots of fruits and vegetables. They're not just eating like berries. So I think that's why you see such conflicting evidence in the scientific literature. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. Now, did you know any difference in outcomes between male and female participants in any of your studies?
Yeah, our studies have been a little bit too small from the dietary intervention study anyways, to assess differences by sex at birth. We haven't seen that adjusting, meaning taking into account a person's sex at birth in these large group studies, though, has led to any meaningful differences in the outcomes.
Thank you. And we have another question. Is there still a feeling that epidemiological factors such as geographical ones are involved in the relative incidence of multiple sclerosis?
Yeah, that's a great question. There still is a gradient of MS risk throughout the world where people closer to the equator seem to have a lower risk of developing MS. And because sunlight exposure also tracks with that equatorial distribution or latitudinal distribution, that was the reason that vitamin D became of interest, since most of our vitamin D naturally comes through sun exposure. I think there are a lot of other things at play. A lot of the equatorial regions, for example, are like, they don't have as many neurologists, for example, and are under-resourced in terms of workup. So I think we don't really know the full scope of MS in many countries. But yes, I still think that's the case to some extent.
Thank you. And then we have one final question. And it's around, did any of the participants in these studies, specifically the intermittent fasting study, were they on any disease regulating medications for MS?
Yeah, in the intermittent fasting study, people were either on no medication or they were on an injectable therapy for multiple sclerosis, but they had to have been on the same therapy for some time without plans of changing it, so that the biological measures we were doing weren't sort of trumped by changes in the disease modifying therapy that might occur mid-study.
All right, well, thank you so much, Dr. Mowry. And should anybody else have any additional questions, you can just type them into the Q&A. Great. All right, so we are going to move on to our third presenter. Dr. Marilyn Albert is Professor of Neurology and Director of the Division of Cognitive Neuroscience and of the Johns Hopkins Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. She has a long-standing interest in the study of lifestyle factors that influence risk of cognitive decline as people get older. She has received many awards for her contributions to AD research, most recently the Henry Wisnowski Lifetime Achievement Award given by the Alzheimer's Association in 2019. So Dr. Albright, I'll pass it on to you.
It's a great pleasure to talk to you all this afternoon. We're going to be switching tacks a little bit, as you can see, and talk about lifestyle changes that might delay the onset of cognitive decline. Hold on a second. This is not, okay, great. And as you heard, most of the time I spend working on Alzheimer's disease. And of course, there's been an enormous amount of work in that area over the last few decades because it's such a common disorder and everybody is trying to do something about it. But in recent years, it's become clear that Alzheimer pathology begins decades before the onset of symptoms. And that's really expanded the research in lifestyle factors, because the idea is that if there are lifestyle factors that might delay cognitive decline and progression to dementia, those are the things that you might want to begin to do early in life. And what I'm going to do today is just focus on a recent report from the National Academy of Science where they reviewed all the data that existed. This was published in 2017, and it was quite a comprehensive review. And it was done in a very uniquely, a unique fashion. So the National Institute on Aging commissioned this report and asked a group of experts at the University of Minnesota to review all the evidence-based data. In other words, the randomized trials that had been done in the prior decades. They came up with a set of findings. They presented those findings to a committee that was organized by the National Academies. And that committee ended up emphasizing 3 lifestyle interventions as promising: cognitive training, physical activity, and management of high blood pressure. And so what I'm going to do is just very briefly review the examples of findings in these 3 areas and give you a sense of why the committee came up with these conclusions. So the first is what we know about cognitive training and maintenance of mental abilities. And the best data that supports this conclusion comes from a study called the ACTIVE study, which stands for Advanced Cognitive Training for Independent and Vital Elderly. And this was a study that was started quite a long time ago in 1998. There were 6 sites around the United States. There were almost 3,000 people in this study. And everybody in the study was 65 years of age or older. At entry, nobody was supposed to have any significant cognitive or functional impairments. And they examined 3 different types of training, and they compared it to a control condition. And what makes this study so particularly valuable is that the participants have been followed now for a very long time. The published data is from follow-ups 5 years later, and then 10 years later, and now there's actually a follow-up underway looking 20 years later. And the primary goal was to see whether or not the cognitive training that people had not only improved their mental abilities on the tasks that were trained, but generalized to instrumental activities of daily living, to more general things in how people were managing day to day. So what did this study consist of? As I said, there were 3 different kinds of interventions. One was memory training, another was reasoning training, a third was speed, and then this control condition, which was what we call a non-contact control, where they just got educational materials, but there was no intervention whatsoever. And what makes this study so unique, in addition to the long-term follow-up, is the size of the study, as I mentioned, almost 3,000 people, and that it included about 25% of the participants who were from minority backgrounds. And the training was not the same as you would do if you went onto the internet and did some kind of training on an app. It was in-person training in groups. There were 10 sessions over 6 weeks, so it actually wasn't a lot of training. And then at 11 months later and 35 months later, they had booster sessions in a subset of the people where they gave some additional training exposure. My own impression, and this is just my hypothesis, is that one of the keys to this training was that they not only gave people training, but they emphasized how what they were learning was related to everyday activities. So for example, in the speed training, it was really what we call dual tasks, sort of switching your attention back and forth between different things. And they emphasized how relevant this was to driving, that when you're driving, you're trying to pay attention to multiple things, and this training might help people in that regard. So 10 years later, what they found was that in fact, the training that people had had years before were still improving their mental abilities in those specific domains. So the people who had memory training were performing better on different memory tests 10 years later. The people who had reasoning training were performing better on the reasoning tests, and the people who had the speed training were also performing better on the speed tests. But the most important thing was that they found was that the training had an impact on reports of instrumental activities of daily living 10 years later. So all of the people who were in these different training groups had fewer reports of difficulties in daily life than the people in the control group. So this was really quite a remarkable finding. As I said, I'm part of a group of people that are beginning to look 20 years later to see whether or not this training had an impact on the prevalence of dementia 20 years later, and stay tuned, you will be hearing about that shortly. But what these results emphasize is that the types of training that were done are probably very meaningful and delay the onset of cognitive decline many, many years later. Now, the information about physical activity and maintenance of mental abilities is very impressive, but the follow-up is nowhere near the kind of follow-up that has been observed in the active study. So just one example of the kinds of things that we have learned from exercise training is this one study done by Erickson and colleagues. And what they compared was the influence on the brain and mental abilities given different types of exercise. They compared aerobic activity with stretching. The study that I'm just describing here had 120 participants. The mean age was 65. The study was 1 year long, and they did a lot of different measurements in these people at the beginning and then at the end of the study. And what they found was that the people who engaged in the aerobic exercise had changes in brain volume on their magnetic resonance imaging scan. So the part of the brain that's really essential for normal memory is the hippocampus. You may have heard about it. And they found that the volume of the hippocampus was actually increased in comparison to other brain regions. And I'll show you a slide with that in just a moment. They also found that memory performance was correlated with the volume of the hippocampus. So memory performance improved, and that improvement was related to the volume of the hippocampus. And they measured something in blood called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And the reason that I'm mentioning it is that there's a lot of evidence from animal models that when animals are more physically active, they have increases in this trophic factor, and that seems to be why there's a benefit in mental ability. And indeed, they found the same thing in this study. And this is just to show you the results from The brain imaging that was done, which I find really pretty impressive. If you look at the top figure where it says hippocampus and you look at the blue or purple, green lines, whatever they are, you see that the volume of the hippocampus is going up in comparison to the people in the other, the stretching task. And you see the other brain regions, there really were no changes. So this was specific to the hippocampus, which is really quite impressive. So as I said, this study only took place for a year, so we don't have the same kind of follow-up. But this is why the National Academy Committee said there's really very encouraging evidence that being more physically active is beneficial for the brain and delays the cognitive decline. And lastly, I wanted to talk about vascular risks and maintenance of cognitive function. And we've actually been hearing a little bit about vascular risks from both the two prior speakers. We've been hearing about obesity and the importance of diabetes and high blood pressure. And there have been many, many observational studies indicating that if you have more vascular risks, high blood pressure, diabetes, high cholesterol, obesity, if you're smoking, you're less likely to maintain cognitive function over time. But the question really is, does that have a long-term benefit from lots of different perspectives? And the best study that we have along this line is called the Atherosclerosis Risk and Community Study. And Johns Hopkins is one of the 4 sites. And again, this is a study that was started many, many years ago. It was started in 1987. There were almost 16,000 participants. There were 4 sites. And at that time, they were primarily interested in cardiovascular disease, and they were looking at much younger people. So they were looking at people 44 to 66. And over the years, there have been many subsequent visits, but the important thing from the perspective of assessing cognitive decline is that at visits 2 and 4 and 5, they had cognitive testing. And then in 2011, a study was funded called the ARIC Neurocognitive Study, looking at whether or not vascular risks from midlife were related to cognitive decline more than 20 years later. And in the ARIC Neurocognitive Study, in addition to looking at changes in cognition, we also looked at diagnoses of mild cognitive impairment and also dementia. And we looked at the same kinds of vascular risks that I mentioned before: blood pressure, diabetes, cholesterol, weight, and smoking, and then some other factors. And the key importance of this study, as I alluded to before, is the very large sample size, and also that about 25% of the participants were from minority backgrounds, and also that there's this enormously long follow-up period of 25 years. And I'll just present 2 findings from this study. There's been an enormous amount of information from it, but what we found was that high blood pressure in midlife increased the risk of dementia more than 25 years later, and it increased the risk by about 39%. So this is really quite a striking relationship. And even more, what we found was that diabetes in midlife increased the risk of dementia 25 years later, and the increase in risk was 77%. And some of you may know that there's a gene for Alzheimer's disease that increases risk for Alzheimer's disease. It's called the ApoE gene. And the risk from that gene for Alzheimer's disease is about the same level of risk as diabetes in midlife. Now, that's all observational data. And when the National Academies wrote its report, it didn't really have any persuasive randomized trials. But since then, there's been a very important study that's been published called Sprint Mind. And this consisted of over 9,000 people. The participants were 50 years and older. They all had hypertension. And in the study, they had 2 different levels of blood pressure control. They either used the standard level of 120 systolic blood pressure or more intense treatment 140, or the more intense treatment of 120. And what they found was that 8 years later, there was a lower prevalence of people with mild cognitive impairment. Now, everybody started out as cognitively normal, and that means that 8 years later, the number of people who had progressed to develop mild cognitive impairment was significantly decreased. There was a lower prevalence of dementia, but it wasn't statistically significant. And the hypothesis is that they just weren't able to follow people long enough to see that outcome. So in general, I think what we know now is that there's really quite good evidence that cognitive training is protective for the brain and delays the onset of cognitive decline. There's increasing evidence that physical activity may be effective, and management of high blood pressure. And now, not only these data come from observational studies, but also randomized trials. So the conclusion from the national academies was that this was very promising, but that it wasn't yet sufficient to warrant a public health campaign. But I think increasingly over time, all the data that are accumulating are continuing to emphasize the benefits of these three approaches. So just to conclude, there's clearly an enormous public health interest in this area, and I would just send you to a few sources of information. So there's the Global Council on Brain Health from AARP, and also a Staying Sharp program, and lots of sources of information about this, because in general, people are trying to provide this information to the general public as accurately as they can. So let me stop there.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Albert. We have a handful of questions in the chat, so I will start with the first one. Did the people in the cognitive studies, did they have a family history of dementia?
So some of the people in the cognitive training study did, but in general, that was not why they were selected. And I think you can be pretty sure that because of the enormous size of these studies, that was really not a factor. And I'm fairly sure, although I'm not positive, that they included those factors in their analyses and still were able to demonstrate that the cognitive training was beneficial.
For physically active, when a resting heart rate is comparable to athletes, how important is it to elevate the heart rate at least 70% for benefits?
So that's a good question, and I think we don't know the answer to that. So it is true that most of the randomized trials have showed that aerobic activity is more beneficial than stretching, but there's a lot of observational data to suggest that just being active, just walking, going up and down stairs, lifting heavy objects might be beneficial. That, in fact, all the original epidemiological studies asked those kinds of questions and were the source of these randomized trials. So I think one of the things we really don't know yet is how much physical activity is necessary. Do you have to elevate your heart rate? If so, for how much? But that's surely going to be information that's going to be forthcoming.
Thank you. And then we have a question here based on some of the charts that you had shared. It appears speed training had the most impact on maintaining activity level. Does this indicate it is something that should be emphasized, or is the difference not significant?
No, you absolutely caught it, and it's something that surprised, I think, everybody in the study. It's what they called speed training definitely had the biggest effect, but it wasn't speed training in the way we normally think about it. What I tried to explain is that it was what we call divided attention. So it was looking at something and then looking at something else and trying to switch your attention back and forth as quickly as possible. And one of the aspects of it that I think may be important is that it was what we call adaptive training, which is that the better people got, the more they were able to be challenged. So it adapted to them. it's absolutely something that needs to be examined, because for sure it clearly had more long-term benefits than the other tasks, and maybe might be easier to do.
And then we have a question around your thoughts regarding learning new skills such as language or musical interests or instruments to address memory reasoning and less so speed for cognitive improvement.
I think we don't know the answer to that. For sure, what the training did in active was to give people strategies for how to better remember things, or how to think through tasks that were challenging in terms of reasoning. But as I mentioned, they emphasized how those related to daily activities. And so my own hypothesis is that part of the reason this training was so beneficial is that people continued to exercise those strategies. And so that would suggest that just challenging your brain is not all that, it should be a little bit more than that, but I think we don't know the answer.
All right, and we have a question here that says, how true is it that the incidence of dementia is declining according to a recent clipping I think I read somewhere? How do you exclude an ecological fallacy here?
So there is some good evidence from a number of studies that the prevalence of dementia is decreasing slightly. It's still enormously high. I mean, it's terrifyingly high, but it is decreasing slightly. And we hypothesize that it might have to do with the kinds of things that happen to people when they're very young. So people who were studied and were elderly, for example, in the 1980s, they were young at the turn of the century. And so the health care they got, the exposure to infection that they got, the diets that they had, maybe made their brains less resilient. And I think right now that's the hypothesis, that it's a cohort effect, that in general, the improvements in healthcare are beneficial long-term also for dementia, but it doesn't mean that the risk is not going away. It's still very, very high.
Thank you. And Dr. Albert, we have one more question, and it states, how does a vegetarian or a vegan diet influence the risk of cognitive decline?
So I will just say that in the National Academy's review, we did look at a lot of dietary studies. There were a number of them that were examined, and there were a number of them that tried different dietary approaches. And the reason that the National Academy report didn't talk about diet as being promising is that the impression everybody has is that the dietary benefit is by altering vascular risks. So you've heard this sort of throughout this session, that reducing vascular risk is really, really important. And it's one of the main takeaways, I think, when you think about dementia, because we hypothesize that if you have Alzheimer's pathology and then you have vascular pathology on top of it, you're much more likely to have cognitive decline. And we know something about how to control vascular risks, and diet is certainly one of them.
Wonderful. Well, thank you once again, Dr. Albert, and thank you to all of our doctors here that have participated in today's session. And thank you to all of our attendees for all your great questions. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Jamie to close us out.
Hi. Well, I just want to say thank you to everybody for being here today. We'd like to thank our speakers for their time and their talent, and we'd also like to thank you, Gina, for moderating. A follow-up email will be shared with you following this webinar that will include a recording of the program along with a list of resources and our event schedule. We hope you'll join us at a future event. Thanks again.